Hello, time for a Man in Gray book review. Today we have not one book, but 50 books. This is the Penguin Modern Box Set, published in 2019 by Penguin Random House. 50 volumes by various authors. It's 3,200 pages long, and yes, I've read all of these. This is a follow-up to another box set that I did a couple of videos on a few months ago, the Penguin Little Black Classics, which look like this. Penguin Random House released a box set of 80 of these little paperback books in 2015 to mark the 80th anniversary of Penguin Books. And so there are 80 volumes for the 80 years. And they were basically excerpts from longer Penguin books. Each one of these little books is about 65 pages long, so the idea is it's a sampler. This is a book, most people can read 65 pages in about an hour, so the idea was give people a sampler of the range of books we have that they can read in one sitting. And these were all books that were in the public domain, so books from ancient times up until the early 1920s. And the set was so popular, even though it was 80 volumes and rather expensive, it was such a popular set that they started selling them as individual books. And then they added another 20 volumes to it, so they had 100 books altogether. And again, it became so popular that they decided a few years later to come out with another box set of writers from the 20th century, and that's what this is, the Penguin Modern box set. Now, these writers' writings are all still in copyright, and so all the writers in this box set, the copyright is controlled by Penguin Random House. So, in other words, you're not going to see some prominent writers from the 20th century because they wrote for other publishing companies. So there's no James Joyce, there's no Ernest Hemingway, there's no Toni Morrison, there's no John Updike, so forth, no Gunter Grass. But there's still a pretty good range of writers from around the world in this box set. And again, each book is about 65 pages. Most of them are excerpts from other longer Penguin books, so you can read it kind of as a sampler. So it's a good way to, if you're interested in 20th century writers, to introduce yourself to some if you're not familiar with them. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause this video for just a second, and I'm going to take all these books out, and very quickly I'm going to go through all 50 volumes and tell you a little bit, very briefly, about each one, and then my final thoughts on this whole set. Okay, here we go. Let's go through these. The first book in the set is Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. This, of course, is his famous essay about civil disobedience. King wrote this while he was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, for holding a parade without a permit. And they didn't give him any writing papers, so he wrote this essay in the margins of newspapers and then smuggled it out of the prison. It's basically an explanation for why he thought there was a moral duty to civilly disobey segregation laws. And it also contains a short sermon, the transcript of a short sermon that King did a few years later. So, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Number two, Allen Ginsberg. This is called Television Was a Baby Crawling Toward That Death Chamber. Allen Ginsberg, one of the major beat poets from the 1950s and 60s. This is a collection of some of his poems. His most famous poem, of course, is Howl, which is not in here. But this is a collection of beat poetry by Allen Ginsberg. All right, number three, Daphne du Maurier, the famous British suspense writer, best known for her novel Rebecca. This is called The Breakthrough. This is a collection of, well, I think it's just one story. This is just one novella, a suspense novella by Daphne du Maurier, The Breakthrough. Okay, so that one is a complete unit. Then we have Dorothy Parker, The Custard Heart. This is a collection of short stories by one of the members of the Algonquin Round Table in the 1920s. This is a collection of her short stories. It also includes her most famous work, a short story called Big Blonde, which was an autobiographical story about her suicide attempt in the 1920s, Dorothy Parker. Let's see, the next one we have, put my glasses on where I can read this. This is number 5. This is 3 Japanese short stories, and I know I'm going to butcher these names, so please forgive me. The 3 writers are Nagai Kafu, Uno Koji and Atagawa Ranusiki. This is a collection of 3 stories from the Penguin Book of Japanese Short Stories. These are all writers who were active in the 1920s and 30s in Japan, so pre-war fiction. Ananias Nin, the writer who's best known for her diaries. This is The Veiled Woman. This is a collection of 4 short stories by Nin. Then we have George Orwell, of course, the famous novelist and essayist famous for 1984 and Animal Farm. It's a collection of I think three of his essays. If you haven't read any of Orwell's nonfiction, you really owe it to yourself. He was I think a better nonfiction writer than a novelist. George Orwell. Next we have number 8, Gertrude Stein Food. This is a set of poetry and prose pieces excerpted from her book Tender Buttons, which I'm not a big fan of Gertrude Stein. Some people like her. She's kind of an experimental writer. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of, frankly, just gibberish in here. But she was an important writer. I think inspired better writers than she was. Gertrude Stein Food. Okay, next we have some science fiction. I think this is the only science fiction volume in the set. This is number 9. Stanislaw Lem, 3 Electro Nights. Stanislaw Lem was a Polish science fiction writer back in the 60s and 70s. There are 4 short stories here. Excellent, excellent European science fiction. Stanislaw Lem, if you haven't read his stuff and you're into science fiction. Then we have some poetry, finally. This is Patrick Kavanagh, Irish poet and novelist. The Great Hunger. The Great Hunger is his probably his greatest work. It's a long poem about poverty, the impoverished Irish in the 19th century. So really great Irish poet here, Patrick Kavanagh, The Great Hunger. Now we have Danilo Kis. This is a Serbian writer, born actually in Yugoslavia, but that's now part of Serbia. This is a collection of a couple of stories. Danilo Kis was Jewish, but his parents had him baptized into the Orthodox Christian Church, and that's why he survived the Holocaust. Both his parents were killed by the Nazis, but he was able to survive because he was registered as a Christian, so they didn't deport him. Anyway, okay, that's that one. Next, we have number 12, Ralph Ellison, of course, the famous African-American novelist, famous for his book Invisible Man, called The Black Ball. This is, I think, 4 of his short stories. He was also an excellent short story writer, so Ralph Ellison. And then Jean Rhys, British writer, is best known for her novel The Wide Sargasso Sea. This is a collection of 4 short stories by Jean Rhys. Then we have Franz Kafka. Of course, the Czech writer is best known for The Metamorphosis and The Castle. This is Investigations of a Dog. This is either a short novella or a long short story. But if you're a fan of Kafka and you haven't read Investigations of a Dog, it's very typical of his shorter fiction. Clarice Lispector, Daydream and Drunkenness of a Young Lady. Lispector was born in, I think she was born in Britain, but she actually spent most of her, Ukraine, sorry. She's born in Ukraine, but she spent most of her life in Brazil, and she wrote in Portuguese. Kind of a surrealist writer. Again, I'm not a big fan of Lispector's writing, but some people really swear by it. There's kind of a cult. She has kind of a cult following. So, I think you owe it to yourself to read at least a little bit of Clarice Lispector. She's an interesting writer. I just don't care for her very much. Anyway, some short stories there. Okay, another Polish writer, Ryszard Kapuscinski. This is called an advertisement or an advertisement for toothpaste. Kapuscinski was a travel writer, and this is a collection of his travel pieces as he traveled through Eastern Europe in the 1950s. Okay. Then we have Albert Camus, the famous French Nobel Prize winner, novelist, and existential philosopher. This is called Create Dangerously. This is a collection of 3 of his essays, 3 of his short essays. So Albert Camus, youngest person, I think, to ever win the Nobel Literature Prize. Okay, then we have a writer you probably heard of, John Steinbeck. This is called The Vigilante. Vigilante. This is 3 short stories from a collection he published in 1938. He published this book of short stories same time he was working on The Grapes of Wrath, and they're short stories about California, the part of California he was always writing about. Okay, then we have a really major writer from Portugal, Fernando Pessoa. I have more souls than one. Pessoa was an incredibly prolific writer. He died when I think he was 47, but he wrote hundreds and hundreds of poems and novels and books. He created over 70 pseudonyms, and people are still trying to track down everything he wrote. He was also multilingual. He wrote in Portuguese and French and English. This is a collection of some of his Portuguese poems that have been translated into English. A major romantic poet, Fernando Pessoa. Then we have Shirley Jackson, famous horror writer, famous for her story The Lottery and the novel The Hunting of Hill House, which some people consider the first horror novel. This is called The Missing Girl. This is a collection of 3 short stories, 3 suspense or horror short stories by Shirley Jackson. Next we have 4 Russian short stories. Once again, I'll try to pronounce the names of these writers. Hopefully I can do this without mangling them. Nina Berskova. No, I'm sorry. Nina Berberova. Yuri Felsen, Gato Gazdanov, and Galina Kurznetsova. These were all writers who fled Russia when the Bolsheviks took over. So these are all Russian exile writings. These are a collection of short stories, 4 Russian short stories. Next, we have one of my favorite writers of the 20th century, Italo Calvino, an Italian experimental writer, probably best known for his novel Invisible Cities. This is called The Distance of the Moon. Yeah, Distance of the Moon, collection of 4 of his experimental short stories. Kind of a postmodernist writer, very, very much worth reading, Italo Calvino. Then we have a collection of essays. This is called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. Audre Lorde, prominent black feminist, lesbian critic and poet. This is a collection of her essays from the 1970s. Okay, I'm going to put these down here as we're running out of room. Next, we have volume number 24. Another writer that is kind of an acquired taste, Leonora Carrington, The Skeleton's Holiday. Carrington was both a painter and a writer. She was a surrealist. I think she lived to be 94 or 95. She was the last of the surrealist painters to die. And she wrote, this is a collection of her short stories. There's like 7 of them. They're all very short. They're all very strange. And again, if you're into surrealism, these are really good. If you're not, you're just going to say, "What is this?" But again, it's worth checking out. Leonora Carrington. Then we have another one of the major beat writers from the 1950s, William S. Burroughs. This is called The Finger. Burroughs best known probably for his book Naked Lunch. This is like 6 short stories, if you can call them that. They're kind of rambling, stream of consciousness kind of stuff. William Burroughs. Burroughs, by the way, was actually featured in an episode of Saturday Night Live in the 1970s reading some of his poetry. It's hard to imagine now that SNL would have a poet on their show reading his poetry, but they did that in the 70s. Okay, then we have Samuel Beckett, the Irish poet and playwright. Most of his stuff is in French. This is called The End. This is a collection of 2 rather long stories. I think these were both written in French, and then he translated them into English. A very depressing writer. There's a great story about Beckett where he and one of his friends were walking in the streets of Paris on one sunny spring morning, and his friend looked around and said, "A day like this makes you glad to be alive." And Beckett looked at him and said, "Well, I wouldn't go that far." So anyway, it's sort of absurdist, pessimistic, existential writing. Then we have another experimental writer, Kathy Aker. This is called New York City in 1979. This is actually a complete work. It's not an excerpt. She was one of the leaders of the punk movement in the 1970s. And this is a kind of a set of diary entries about and poems about living in New York in 1979. And it's unusual because it also has a collection of photographs, black and white photographs of different parts of New York to go along with Akers' kind of in-your-face writing. So New York City in 1979 by Kathy Aker. Then we have the great Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, Africa's Tarnished Name. He was the first really major Nigerian novelist. He wrote Things Fall Apart. This is a collection of his essays, though. He also wrote a number of nonfiction things, a collection of 4 essays about Nigeria's place in the world. Okay, then we have Susan Sontag, Notes on Camp, the famous critic. This is her famous essay about camp culture, campy culture, the kind of highbrow mixing with lowbrow stuff. She was one of the first writers to really identify camp and define what it was. And I think there's another essay in here as well on culture, One Culture and the New Sensibility. So it's two of Susan Sontag's essays from the 1970s. Then we have John Berger, The Red Tundra of Bologna. John Berger was an English art critic, and this little book is a collection of little aphorisms. As you can see here, most of them are very short, just a few paragraphs or one paragraph. It's a collection of little meditations or aphorisms about different art. So, art criticism by John Berger. Okay, so next we have a French writer, Françoise Sagan. This is called The Gigolo. She wrote, let's see, what was it? Bonjour Tristesse, a novel called Goodbye Sadness in English. Became a famous French novel. She wrote that when she was 18 years old. So became kind of an instant celebrity writer in France. This is a collection of 4 of her short stories from, I think most of these are from the early 1960s. Okay. Then we have another Nigerian writer. I hope I can pronounce his name right. Cyprian Ekwinski. I think it's The Glittering City. It's another. He was a very prolific Nigerian writer. He died just about 3 or 4 years ago. Wrote something like 24 novels and a whole bunch of short stories. Very prolific Nigerian writer. This is just a novella, right? It's like about a 60-page. 50-page. Yeah, it's about a 50-page novella. Okay, so Nigerian fiction. Then we have another beat writer. This series is kind of heavy on beat writers. Jack Kerouac, probably the most famous beat writer. This is Piers of the Homeless Night. This is a collection of stories, I think. Yeah, two stories by the writers best known for On the Road, Jack Kerouac. Then we have Hans Fallada. Why do you wear a cheap watch? This is I think it's the only German writer in this set, which is kind of surprising. A German novelist, and this is 3 short stories by Hans Fallada, German mid-century fiction. Then we have Truman Capote. The Duke is in his domain. This is a long magazine article that Capote wrote for the New Yorker magazine. It's a profile of Marlon Brando. This Capote went and interviewed Brando for an entire day on the set of Sayonara, his movie about Japan after World War II in 1956. This is when Brando was at the peak of his early fame, and it's a real takedown of Brando. It really, really takes Brando apart in this book. Beautifully written, as almost everything by Capote is. The Duke in his domain. Then we have a book by the Canadian/American Nobel Prize winning novelist Saul Bellow. This is Leaving the Yellow House. This is, let's see here. I think this is just one long story. Yeah, it's either a short novella or a long story. It's about 60 pages. So short fiction by Saul Bellow. It's about an alcoholic woman who lives in a desert town, and she has an existential crisis, as almost everybody does in Bellow's fiction. Then we have a writer that I know a lot about, Catherine Ann Porter, because she's from my part of the world. She was born about an hour's drive from here in West Texas in a little small town called Indian Creek. And she's buried there. She's buried in a little tiny cemetery way out in the middle of nowhere. Catherine Ann Porter won the Pulitzer Prize for her only novel, a novel called Ship of Fools, but she's best known for her short stories. She was one of the great short story writers in America in the mid 20th century. And this is called the Cracked Looking Glass. Cracked Looking Glass. And this is I think, that's what we got here. Yeah, this is just a novella or long short story by Catherine Ann Porter. Really good writer if you haven't read her stuff before. Next, we have James Baldwin, of course, the famous African American novelist and essayist. This is called Dark Days. He's probably best known for Giovanni's Room and Go Tell It on the Mountain. This is a collection of three of his essays. Great essayist as well. Just as good a nonfiction writer as a novelist. Then we have Georges Simenon, the Belgian writer. I think I've talked about one of his novels before. Very prolific writer. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of books. He's best known in the United States and really in the English-speaking world for his crime novels starring Inspector Maigret. Maigret novels. These are detective police procedurals. But at the end of his life, he stopped writing fiction and began writing a series of autobiographical works. And this is called Letter to My Mother. This is a kind of an open letter that he wrote like a decade after his mother's death, in which he kind of goes through his difficult relationship he had with his mom and kind of tries to work out, come to peace with his mother's memory. So it's very serious work, much different from, well, not that his detective novels aren't serious too, but it's serious in a different way. Georges Simenon, Letter to My Mother. Okay, then we're getting close to the end here, folks. This is number 40, Death the Barber by William Carlos Williams. This is a collection of poems by one of America's top modernist poets of the early 20th century. Kind of acquired taste. Not a big fan of Williams' poetry, but he's important. He had a lot of influence on other writers. Okay. Then we have Betty Friedan, the famous American feminist from the 1960s and 70s. She's the one who wrote The Feminine Mystique, one of the great early feminist books. This is called The Problem That Has No Name. And I think this is, two essays about feminism in the 1960s and 70s by Betty Friedan. Then we have some poetry by the great Spanish poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. He, of course, was killed in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, a collection of some of his poetry. Then we have Yuko Shuhima of Dogs and Whales. She was a prominent Japanese writer in the 70s and 80s, and this is a feminist, one of the early feminist writers in Japan in post-World War II era. It's a collection of two of her short stories, Dogs and Whales. Dogs and Whales. Javier Mercedes, another Spanish writer who died just a couple of years ago. This is a great title, Madame du Deffand and the Idiots. It's a collection of, I think, 5 short stories by a major Spanish novelist and short story writer. Then we have Carson McCullers, the Georgia writer, one of the great Southern Gothic writers, best known probably for writing The Member of the Wedding and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. This is called The Haunted Boy, and this is a collection of 3 short stories by Carson McCullers. Then we have the Argentinian short story writer Jorge Luis Borges, The Garden of Forking Paths. This is a collection of, 5 of his short stories. Borges was one of the most influential writers to come out of Argentina. He had a great influence on the magical realism movement. All those writers that came out in the 60s and 70s, very much influenced by Borges. Then we have Andy Warhol, who wasn't really a writer. He's an artist, of course. It's called Fame. This is some excerpts from his diary. For years, he would dictate his diary to one of his flunkies. And I think the complete diary, which I have over there somewhere, was like 700 or 800 pages long. This is a collection. They're mostly little short comments on what he was doing and a little gossip about people he was hanging out with in the 1970s. So famed by Andy Warhol. Then we have 3 stories by the Russian/American writer Vladimir Nabokov, who's of course best known for Lolita. This is called Lance. There's 3 stories here. The first story is written in Russian and then translated into English, and the other 2 were written directly in English. Nabokov's career can be divided into 2 parts. He wrote his early novels in Russian. He fled Russia after the Bolsheviks took over and became an exiled writer in France. And then when World War II broke out, he moved to America and began writing in English. And so some of his novels were in Russian, some in English. And this is 3 short stories, 1 in Russian and 2 in English. Then we have Primo Levi, an Italian writer and chemist and Holocaust survivor, best known for his book, The Periodic Table. This is called The Survivor, which he was. He was a Holocaust survivor. And this is a collection of poetry. In addition to writing novels and essays, he also was a good poet as well. So a collection of poetry from that. Then we come to the final book. And this is the book by the only writer of this set who's still alive, Wendell Berry, a poet, novelist, and essayist from Kentucky who writes a lot about farm life because he lives on a farm. This is called Why I'm Not Going to Buy a Computer. And it's a collection of essays, 2 little essays, 2 long essays by Wendell Berry, where he contrasts city life with life in the country. And so Wendell Berry is also, I think, one of 2 or 3 living writers to have a volume in the Library of America series as well. So kind of unique in both ways. I think he's like 95 or 96 years old now. So he's quite old. I think he's still writing. Wendell Berry. And that's it, folks. That's all 50 of these things. And so as you can see here, it's a nice collection of writers. It doesn't have all the major writers from the 20th century, but a really good collection from all over the world. The United States, Britain, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Japan. I think the only major country missing here is probably, Korea, South Korea and China are not in here, but there's a lot. It's a nice collection. And so if you want to get into some more 20th century writing, each one of these little books is available separately, so you don't have to buy the whole box set if you don't want to. So if you as I went through there, if there were any of those that sound intriguing to you, you might want to get them. The last time I checked, I think on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and some of those places, you can usually buy these for about $5 to $6 American dollars. So they're not hugely expensive. So you can buy them separately if you don't want to buy the whole set. So that's it. The box set is the Penguin Modern box set by various authors. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.